In today's video, we are continuing my coverage of Unreal Engine 5 games and the latest GPUs. How well do they hold up? Not just looking at ultra settings, but high settings, upscaling, frame generation when it's available, all of that. And why are we looking at the 4070 Ti and the 7900 XT paired up in this video? Well, if we take a look at current pricing, they basically cost the same. 7900 XTs, cheapest models available around $760 and going up from there. And then if we take a look at the 4070 Ti, we are also seeing, again, cheapest models beginning around $760 and going up from there. So these GPUs cost the same. 4070 Ti only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM versus the 20 gigabytes on the 7900 XT, but NVIDIA does have some feature set advantages, ray tracing advantages, all of that. But man, these are expensive. So honestly, guys, you should really think about buying used and selling your old GPU as well to help fund GPU upgrades. And today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, is a fantastic place to do that. And I can give you guys $10 off your first purchase if you use my code OWEN10. Click the link in the video description and the pinned comment to take a look at what's available. Currently, there's still a holiday gift guide if you're doing your last minute Christmas shopping or some after Christmas shopping or whatever, including an Ultimate Tech Tuber gift guide at a various price points, what different tech tubers recommend. But again, I also mentioned that you can sell your GPU here in order to help fund your upgrade. A lot of people are afraid of selling it themselves, selling locally, getting mugged when you're handing over big stacks of cash. Well, it can be as simple as this. You just click Get an Offer. And once you click that button, it's as simple as tell them the GPU model and condition for an instant offer, print your free shipping label, and mail the GPU. They'll inspect it, make sure everything checks out, and you will, most sellers get paid within 1 business day after the part is received. Again, $10 off your first purchase, and click the link in the video description and pinned comment. Take a look at Jawa. Now, in this video, like I said, we're going to be taking a look at these GPUs, but I should also throw out the fact that there is heavily rumored, this is not official, that this price segment could get shaken up towards the end of January. So you might want to hold off anyway. Just a reminder that the 40 series super cards are rumored to be coming out in January. And that means, and specifically, actually, we have some rumored release dates and everything like that, where the 4070 Ti Super reveal probably on January 8th, and then reviews available on January 23rd and on shelves January 24th. So with these being heavily rumored, and with the increase from 12 gigabytes to 16 gigabytes being the rumor, along with 10% more CUDA cores, and if there's memory bandwidth increases or anything like that, it could be even more than a 10% performance difference. Again, could be something to keep your eye on, and I thought I'd point that out at the beginning before we roll the benchmarks. But let's do the benchmarks and give you some final thoughts at the end. Let's start our testing in the most demanding of the Unreal Engine 5 games I've been looking at here with Lords of the Fallen, and we'll start out at the Ultra preset, although at 1440p. And yeah, it's looking like these $800 GPUs are what it takes to get a 60 FPS average at 1440p Ultra. Except actually we're falling a little bit short of it. We're still not actually quite averaging 60 FPS. The 4070 Ti is averaging 58, giving it a 4% lead over the 7900 XT, which is hitting 56 frames per second in this run. And the 1% lows are actually hanging down at 47 and 45 respectively. But what if we drop down to high settings rather than ultra? The game still looks very good, and we do get a large performance bump. We're now seeing the 4070 Ti offering 80 FPS on average, and the 7900 XT offering 78 FPS on average. That's giving the 4070 Ti a 3% lead. Although in the 1% lows, I'm noticing a much stronger lead for the 4070 Ti at 61 versus 50. Now, that is a 22% lead in the 1% lows, and it's a bit interesting. I notice in this area, a lot of times when I do this run, I do get stutters on the GPUs, but it just looked, it's traversal stutter in Unreal Engine 5. It just did seem a bit worse on the AMD GPU. Anyway, if we go ahead and kick on upscaling instead of turning down settings, so we're actually back to the ultra settings, but this time we're just using DLSS and FSR respectively at the quality upscaling preset. We're seeing the 4070 Ti hitting 89 FPS average and the 7900 XT hitting 81, giving the 4070 Ti a 10% lead in the averages. Also still getting a 21% lead in the 1% lows. And now I'd also give the image quality advantage to DLSS here over FSR. Not sure how much it comes through in YouTube videos, but little blades of grass, things disoccluded in motion, all that looks a bit better on the DLSS image. But now we're looking at 4K resolution. Back to the ultra preset. So you want to max this game out. Well, these GPUs just aren't going to be where you want to be. 32 FPS average on both of them. That's a complete tie. The 1% lows are 28 and 26 respectively, giving the 4070 Ti the 8% lead in the 1% lows. So that is a bit rough. And so we're definitely going to need to turn something down. If we go down to the high preset, they're now both tied at 45 FPS in the averages. And if we take a look at the 1% lows, we are seeing a small lead for the 4070 Ti, but it is only a 6% lead. That is 2 frames per second, 38 versus 36. So clearly going down to the high preset is probably still not where most people would want to be, although, you know, playing in the mid-40s on a controller, the style of game might be totally fine, but I think, you know, a lot of people would certainly be chasing for more frames per second, especially on GPUs this expensive. So what if you tried using upscaling instead? And again, this time going back to the ultra preset, so maxing things out, but kicking on DLSS and FSR this time at the quality setting, which is actually basically a 1440p internal rendering resolution, and then reconstructing a 4K-like output. Image quality-wise, again, especially the character in motion, things like that. Definitely image quality advantage DLSS here. Performance advantage for the 4070 Ti as well at 57 versus 52, giving it a 10% advantage, and a 13% advantage in the 1% lows at 45 versus 40. Now, what about 1080p resolution? At 1080p, we are seeing the 4070 Ti take a 4% lead. It's 80 versus 77. And the 1% lows, the 4070 Ti is taking a 7% lead at 65 versus 61. Now, again, this is pretty expensive graphics cards for a 1080p monitor, but, you know, a lot of people do, focus on esports gaming at high refresh rate 1080p, but then also play some single-player games, so it's definitely not out of the question to be using these GPUs at 1080p resolution. Speaking of which, what if you wanted to turn down to the high settings to get an even higher refresh rate experience? Well, if we go down to the high settings at 1080p here, we are now able to break the 100 FPS average mark, which is good. And the 4070 Ti is at 106 FPS average, and the 7900 XT at 102, giving the 4070 Ti a 4% advantage here. And the 1% lows are also advantage 4070 Ti at 79 versus 70, giving it a 13% advantage in the 1% lows. But let's take a look at another game. This is the Talos Principle 2, and we'll start out at 1440p Ultra. And in at least this area, I know I haven't played a lot of this game yet. I'd like to. It looks pretty interesting. But a lot of people have commented saying that later areas of the game can be more demanding than this one, so keep that in mind. But anyway, we're seeing the 4070 Ti averaging 77, and the 7900 XT averaging 79. So this time, advantage going to the 7900 XT, and the 1% lows are 53 versus 55, again giving about a 4% advantage to the 7900 XT. Now, what if we try turning down graphics settings? Well, if we go down to the high preset, things still look very good, still at native resolution, and we are able to break 100 FPS in this scene at least. averaging 106 FPS on both GPUs. So a tie there, although the 1% lows are 73 versus 68. So actually giving a small lead in the 1% lows to the 4070 Ti here with a 5% advantage. This game actually looks pretty interesting. I'd like to give it a shot. I need to finish Baldur's Gate 3 first, though. I've been playing that since August. That is a very long game. But you guys aren't here to hear me ramble about which games I would like to play. Let's go ahead and take a look at what if we used upscaling. So in this scene, we're looking at what if we went back to the Ultra presets. We want to keep all the settings cranked to the maximum, but this time boost frame rates using upscaling. So DLSS versus FSR again at the quality preset. And we're actually, again, seeing a larger performance boost by using upscaling than we do from going down from ultra to high, which is interesting again. And here we're seeing 124 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 117 on the 7900 XT, giving the 4070 Ti a 6% lead and a 15% advantage in the 1% lows at 84 versus 73. If we go up to 4K resolution and crank everything back to the ultra settings, no upscaling, now the two GPUs are basically tied at 41 frames per second in the averages, which is probably not where most people would want to be again. So we will look at adjusting settings, but also if you take a look at the 1% lows, we're seeing a 32 versus 33. So I would again call that basically a tie, 1 FPS difference. At this frame rate, that does count as a 3% lead for the 7900 XT. Also, interesting always to take a look at the VRAM usage, but here we're under 10 gigabytes on the 4070 Ti and only slightly over 10 gigabytes on the 7900 XT. Anyway, let's try dropping down to the high preset instead of the ultra preset. So now we can still be at 4K native resolution and, at least in this scene, be averaging around 60 FPS. The 7900 XT is actually averaging exactly 60 FPS at the end of this run, whereas the 4070 Ti is hitting 59, so pretty dang close. I'd call it a tie again, 2% lead for the 7900 XT. And now the lead in the 1% lows also goes to the 7900 XT at 46 versus 44, giving it a 5% lead in the 1% lows. But again, turning down settings is not the only way to improve performance. We can also look at using upscaling. And here, again, looking at the quality upscaling, where at 4K resolution gives you an internal resolution of 1440p, and then we try to reconstruct it. I think once again, DLSS is doing a nicer job on things like the foliage, and like, palm tree branches, grass, things like that. Not sure how much it comes through in the YouTube video, but image quality advantage to DLSS here. Performance, both GPUs are now over 70 FPS at 72 versus 73, so basically a tie, 1% advantage to 7900 XT. 1% lows, a bit more of a gap with an advantage to the 7900 XT at 55 versus 51, giving it an 8% lead there. But again, let's explore the what if you're buying these GPUs for high refresh rate 1080p. Well, at 1080p Ultra, we are well over 100 frames per second in the averages at 112 versus 114. So that is a 2% lead for the 7900 XT. And the 1% lows are at 74 versus 70. So 6% advantage for the 7900 XT in the 1% lows. And we do see 1% lows here pretty far off our averages. And if you look at the frame time graphs, there can be a bit of spikes and things like that. Notice Unreal Engine 5 can be pretty hard to push the 1% lows up very high. The engine is just very naturally stuttery. Anyway, let's switch over to another game. This time we're looking at Immortals of Aveum, starting out once again at 1440p Ultra settings. And this time, the 7900 XT has a pretty healthy advantage at 80 FPS versus 72, giving it an 11% lead. I think that's the biggest advantage for the 7900 XT we've seen so far. In the 1% lows, we're seeing a 63 versus 52 advantage again for the 7900 XT, giving it a 21% advantage in the 1% lows this time. We had seen a 20% advantage kind of the other way around at some of our settings we tested in Lords of the Fallen, so interesting to see It definitely swing game by game, which GPU architecture is better. But now this game gives us the interesting opportunity of using frame generation. So here we're looking at 1440p Ultra with DLSS and FSR at the quality upscaling, but then also with frame gen on versus frame gen off. Image quality wise, again, I'd have to give advantage to DLSS, same kind of small details. And I'm comparing average performance without frame generation, where we see the 7900 XT take a 4% lead at 108 versus 104, and the 1% lows are 80 versus 75, 7% lead with the 7900 XT. And overall, frame generation here, the frame time graph goes kind of crazy on the 7900 XT with FSR3. I think it behaves a lot better here if you VSync lock. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at 4K Ultra settings, where both GPUs are definitely struggling, although it is certainly advantage 7900 XT. Where we see it at 42 versus 37, giving it a 14% lead over the 4070 Ti. And the 1% lows are 34 versus 28. Again, advantage 7900 XT, 21% in the 1% lows. So yeah, definitely looking like this title is more consistently in favor of the AMD hardware. And again, this is one of the first implementations of FSR3, so I wonder if AMD had a bit of a help in, optimizing the code and things like that. Anyway, Immortals of Aveum 4K Ultra DLSS FSR quality. So again, what if we use upscaling? Now we are able to break 60 FPS on both GPUs. And again, we still see an advantage for the 7900 XT, but once we're using upscaling, the advantage closes pretty noticeably. So it's now 64 versus 67, 5% advantage to the 7900 XT. And in the 1% lows, we are seeing 56 versus 48, so 17% advantage for the 7900 XT. So more noticeable advantage there in the 1% lows. And once again, let's take a look at frame generation as well as just upscaling without frame generation. So what if we were at 4K Ultra, but this time we wanted to go down to performance mode upscaling? Now I think the image quality advantages for objects in motion, things disoccluded by characters, things like that, are more accentuated, advantage for DLSS. Without frame generation, we're seeing 84 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 88 on the 7900 XT, giving a 5% lead for our 7900 XT. And the 1% lows are a 15% advantage for the 7900 XT at 71 versus 62. And again, the frame time graph looks pretty crazy on frame generation for the 7900 XT if you don't VSync lock, but we're not going to do that because we're measuring performance numbers here. But anyway, Immortals of Aveum at 1080p Ultra. What if we are playing on a 1080p screen? Well, here we are seeing a 6% advantage for the 7900 XT at 108 FPS versus 102 on the 4070 Ti. What about the 1% lows? Well, those are 75 FPS for the 4070 Ti and 80 FPS for the 7900 XT, giving us a 7% advantage for the 7900 XT over the 4070 Ti. So again, not as large of an advantage as we saw at the higher resolution. So it seems like as we lower resolution, either overall or through upscaling, the 4070 Ti kind of closed some of the gaps. But let's take a look at another game. This one is RoboCop Rogue City at 1440p Ultra settings. We're seeing 74 FPS for the 4070 Ti and 80 FPS on the 7900 XT. That is an 8% advantage for the 7900 XT. And what about the 1% lows? Also 8% advantage for the 7900 XT at 67 versus 62. And this is really a pretty interesting looking game too. This is another one I want to actually play myself when I have some more time. But anyway, let's drop down to the high preset rather than the ultra preset. And actually, AMD is now further accentuating the lead at 93 FPS versus 84. So 11% advantage for the 7900 XT now. In the 1% lows, we're seeing 76 versus 69, which is a 10% advantage to the 7900 XT, although the 4070 Ti does get maybe some bonus points for getting 69. Nice. So there's at least has that going for it. Now, we didn't see a massive performance bump by dropping down to the high preset, so it will be interesting to look at upscaling. And frame generation wise, this game supports DLSS frame generation, but not FSR3 frame generation, at least at this point. We'll see if more games start to get frame generation support for FSR3, especially in Unreal Engine 5, now that there is a plugin for it, which didn't exist when this game came out. But anyway, without frame generation, we're getting 104 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 114 on the 7900 XT, so still a 10% lead and a 9% lead in the 1% lows. I'd still give image quality advantage to DLSS here, and I think that's especially noticeable in this game. I really don't like the FSR implementation in this game. Now, what if we move up to 4K Ultra? At 4K Ultra, we are seeing 40 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 41 FPS on the 7900 XT, so not a lot in it here. 3% advantage 7900 XT. 1% lows are 35 versus 36. So again, a 1 frame per second difference. So it's really basically a tie. Technically a 3% advantage to the 7900 XT. So I don't think either of these GPUs would likely be playing this game maxed out at 4K. So what are you going to do? Again, one option is turn down to high settings, but I've been noticing RoboCop doesn't get as large of a performance boost turning down to high settings as we get in some of our other games. Here we're only jumping up to 46 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 49 FPS on the 7900 XT. That does extend the 7900 XT's lead to 7%. And in the 1% lows, we're up to 41 and 43 respectively, giving the 7900 XT a 5% advantage in the 1% lows. But I still don't think this is quite the frame rate most people would be looking for when they're playing a first-person shooter, even a single-player one. So what if, once again, we look at upscaling? So if we're back to the ultra settings, but this time just use DLSS and FSR at the quality setting to try to boost performance, we get a much larger performance gain than we did by going down to the high settings. Here we're now over 60 FPS on both GPUs in the averages, with the 4070 Ti averaging 63 and the 7900 XT at 66, with a 5% lead for the 7900 XT. 1% lows are actually tied, both GPUs giving us 55 frames per second in the 1% lows. So again, we're seeing upscaling seeming to be a better way to gain performance. And what if we actually, speaking of performance, went down to performance mode upscaling? Here I'd say DLSS can still look pretty good, whereas the FSR is a lot harder pressed. I'm not a huge fan of the image quality here. Again, I think YouTube can kind of destroy a lot of the differences, but anyway, also, again, frame generation available for the NVIDIA GPU here. Now we're seeing frame rate-wise without frame generation, 82 on the 4070 Ti and 89 on the 7900 XT, so a 9% advantage and a 7% advantage in the 1% lows for the 7900 XT, but it was definitely image quality advantage for DLSS. Now, what if we drop down to the 1080p screens? I know you guys are out there. So 1080p Ultra, this time we are definitely breaking 100 FPS on both GPUs. The 4070 Ti is at 105 frames per second, and the 7900 XT is at 115 frames per second, giving it a 10% advantage in the averages. In the 1% lows, we're seeing 82 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 89 on the 7900 XT, giving a 9% advantage in the 1% lows. So let's move on to another game. Let's look at Jusant, or perhaps this would be more like Jusant or something like that. Sounds French. I don't know. Anyway, at 1440p ultra settings, we're able to average 83 on the 4070 Ti and 94 on the 7900 XT, giving a 13% advantage to the 7900 XT. And the 1% lows are 56 versus 66, which is an 18% advantage for the 7900 XT. Also, while the averages are higher here than we saw in some other games, there are definitely more demanding areas in the game. Like the initial cave I start my benchmark run out in, you'll see is definitely much lower FPS, like in this cave. But dropping down to the high settings does help boost it up even in that cave area. And we're seeing 111 frames per second on the 4070 Ti and 132 frames per second on the 7900 XT. So 19% advantage for the 7900 XT. And the 1% lows are 75 on the 4070 Ti and 92 on the 7900 XT. So 23% advantage in the 1% lows for the 7900 XT in this game. So this is another game which seems to be a little bit more skewed one way or the other. We've seen some games where these GPUs are almost tied, but in this game we definitely seem to be seeing advantage 7900 XT. What about when we enable upscaling? Well, DLSS and FSR at the quality setting without frame generation gives the 4070 Ti 120 FPS and the 7900 XT a 143 FPS, which is a 19% advantage. And the 1% lows are now 104 versus 82, which is a 27% advantage to the 7900 XT. However, I would once again say image quality advantage here to the 4070 Ti with DLSS. And also the 4070 Ti has access to frame generation where the 7900 XT does not. If we look at 4K Ultra, we now see 50 frames per second on the 4070 Ti and much lower than that in the more demanding areas like that initial cave. And the 7900 XT is up to 53. So our lead is diminishing at 4K resolution. This time only a 6% lead for the 7900 XT, although it is still a lead. And the 1% lows are now 33 versus 36. So a 9% advantage in the 1% lows for the 7900 XT. So definitely a win, just by less than what we were seeing at some other settings we looked at. What if we go down to the high settings at 4K? Well, our averages are now over 60 on both GPUs. Notice that the initial cave area was still well below 60, so these settings, and it's more reflected in the 1% lows, these settings are certainly not going to be like locking an even 60 FPS, but 4K high does get us an average of 65 on the 4070 Ti and 72 on the 7900 XT, which is an 11% lead. And the 1% lows are a 9% advantage for the 7900 XT at 48 FPS versus 44 on the 4070 Ti. But to smooth things out even more in the more demanding areas, what about using upscaling? If we use quality upscaling, DLSS versus FSR here, once again, I would say image quality advantage DLSS. We're now seeing both GPUs averaging much higher numbers and actually staying around 60 in the more demanding areas. And the 4070 Ti is hitting 81 FPS average in this scene, and the 7900 XT is hitting 93, so now a 15% advantage for the 7900 XT. The 1% lows are 54 for the 4070 Ti and 65 for the 7900 XT, giving it a 20% advantage for the 7900 XT as we've lowered the internal resolution. And what if we lower the actual output resolution all the way down to 1080p? Well, now we're seeing the 4070 Ti averaging 111 frames per second and the 7900 XT 129 frames per second, giving us a 16% advantage for the 7900 XT in the averages and a 21% advantage in the 1% lows at 93 versus 77. So we're pretty consistently seeing a pretty heavy advantage for the 7900 XT in this game, and very often in the 1% lows, a 20% or more lead. What about Remnant 2? Well, at 1440p Ultra settings, we are seeing both GPUs able to average a pretty decent frame rate at 4070 Ti at 76 and the 7900 XT at 85, giving it a 12% lead over NVIDIA's contender. The 1% lows are 62 versus 68, giving the 7900 XT a 10% advantage in the 1% lows. Now, Remnant 2 is interesting in that it does use nanite, but I believe its global illumination system isn't using the lumen system that we've been seeing in the other games we've been looking at, but still UE5 and using some of the big features. Now, if we drop down to the high settings, if the frame rates seem almost the same to you, they seem almost the same to me. It does not seem like there's a very big difference between the high preset and the ultra preset in this game. And that means that the 4070 Ti is at 78 now, and the 7900 XT is at 88 now. So a 13% advantage for the 7900 XT at the high preset. And if we look at the 1% lows, we're seeing 63 for the 4070 Ti and 70 for the 7900 XT. 13% advantage for the 7900 XT in the 1% lows. And I think there were some adjustments to the presets in this game after launch through patches, and that could explain some of this. But anyway, let's go down to DLSS and FSR at the quality setting to try to boost frame rate, since going down to high settings didn't really do much. Well, with no frame generation, we're seeing the 4070 Ti at 113 frames per second, and the 7900 XT at 109. So now the 4070 Ti is actually ahead by 4%, so it certainly responded very well to the upscaling here. And the 1% lows, though, are now advantage 7900 XT by 5%, 91 versus 87. So this is honestly pretty close. Might as well call it a tie, although the 4070 Ti has an image quality advantage and can kick on frame generation. So there is that. Now, what if we move up to 4K resolution? If we try to just max everything out at the Ultra preset, we're probably not going to be too happy with the results. The 4070 Ti hitting 40 frames per second, and the 7900 XT hitting 47. That does give the 7900 XT an 18% lead in the averages, and the 1% lows are actually a 20% lead for the 7900 XT at 42 versus 35. So 7 FPS difference, but at these kinds of frame rate numbers, that does account for a 20% difference. So 4K Ultra here is pretty demanding. We're probably going to need to do something to try to boost our performance. And since we saw turning down to high didn't really do a whole lot in this game, rather than test that, let's just look at upscaling. So we'll kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting once again. As you know, the character's arm moves and you see things disoccluded behind it. I think it's just a little bit more fizzly on the FSR implementation, foliage details, things like that. So again, image quality advantage DLSS here. And performance-wise has now once again closed the gap quite a bit. We're still seeing an advantage 7900 XT by 5% in the averages at 69, nice, versus 66. And the 1% lows, a bit more spread at 7900 XT, 60 versus 53, 13% advantage there. And what if we went all the way down to the performance mode? And what if we even allowed for some, frame generation on the 4070 Ti? Well, without frame generation, just at 4K Ultra DLSS performance mode, which is a 1080p internal resolution, we're seeing 91 FPS on the 4070 Ti and 90 on the 7900 XT. So basically a tie, about a 1% lead for the 4070 Ti. And in the 1% lows, we are seeing a 10% lead for the 7900 XT at 78 versus 71. Although, again, image quality-wise, I think the advantages are accentuated for DLSS, the more aggressive setting you use, and you would have frame generation available if you did want to use that. And at 1080p resolution, we're now going, again, ultra settings, no upscaling. Both GPUs are well over 100 FPS. We're seeing 110 FPS average on the 4070 Ti. And 112 FPS average on the 7900 XT, giving it a 2% lead. The 1% lows are 88 on the 4070 Ti and 94 on the 7900 XT, giving it a 7% advantage in the 1% lows. But again, the gap seems to have closed a lot here at this resolution. And let's go ahead and pop out for some final thoughts. So what do I think? We definitely saw these GPUs trading blows. Lords of the Fallen seem to be one of the ones more favored towards the 4070 Ti, especially at certain settings and resolutions. We would sometimes see the 1% lows especially taken advantage. But depending on the exact settings, sometimes it was a less commanding lead. And then as we switched up the games, again, Talos Principle 2 could sometimes kind of go either way, but was a little, sometimes was advantage 4070 Ti. But then as we scrolled into some other games, we were seeing more often advantages, and sometimes large ones for the 7900 XT, sometimes as much as 10% or even 20% in the 1% lows in Immortals of Aveum. We took a look at frame generation. There was a lot of stuff going on here. RoboCop Rogue City was usually a bit of an advantage for the 7900 XT. And then, again, lots of different settings and resolutions, but Jusant, again, usually a bit of an advantage for the 7900 XT, sometimes pretty noticeably so, and Remnant 2, usually an advantage for the 7900 XT. So overall, while we did see some cases like Lords of the Fallen, where it seemed like advantage was 4070 Ti, I would say on average, it does seem like in general, bit of an advantage for the 7900 XT. And I just want to mention that I think that this is one of the reasons why this rumored 4070 Ti Super is probably happening. Again, 10% CUDA core bump. If there's anything else there, a memory bandwidth increase, something like that, to give it another little bit of a bump here, plus the jump from 12 gigabytes to 16 gigabytes, these games where we're seeing that, 10% lead 7900 XT or so would more frequently be a tie or maybe advantage 4070 Ti Super. And so it's looking to me like a lot of this lineup. I think similar thing looking with the 4070 going up to the 4070 Super, where I think they're going to try to get that little bit of an edge over the 7800 XT. And again, 4080 Super probably designed to get that little bit of an edge over the 7900 XTX, so that they can just claim not just feature set advantages, but maybe performance advantages. But again, we don't know the pricing on this. But again, I'm just saying when we see this kind of on average little bit of a lead here for the AMD GPU, I wonder if that's bugging NVIDIA a little bit. I don't know. I don't think NVIDIA minds charging more, but I think they do prefer to just have the advantage when they do so. I don't know. Anyway, so interesting to point that out. Also, it's very important to note that we're just looking at Unreal Engine 5 games here, and these don't seem to be using hardware-accelerated ray tracing. I was curious if Lords of the Fallen was using the hardware-accelerated version of the Lumen lighting system, because there is a hardware RT version of it that would take advantage of those ray tracing cores, but everything you can find says that it's not. So this just does seem to be more of an NVIDIA-sided title rather than being specifically because of hardware-accelerated ray tracing. And none of these games seem to be using the hardware-accelerated ray tracing feature that Lumen does offer in Unreal Engine 5. So just a reminder that if you're looking at these GPUs on a broader picture than just UE5 games, like in previous testing that I've done with these GPUs, if you look at something like heavy ray tracing like RT Ultra at 1440p in Cyberpunk, we're seeing that even with quality upscaling enabled, the 7900 XT will fall below 60 FPS a lot of the time, whereas the 4070 Ti would often be well over 60 FPS, and then you could also kick on frame generation to smooth things out from there. And from that high enough of a base frame rate, I think that'll usually look and feel pretty good. And even without frame generation factored in, a 37% advantage in that heavy ray tracing workload. So remember that there is that feature set advantage. The main thing I've got to say for the 7900 XT here was that it did often have an advantage at the native resolutions when ray tracing wasn't being utilized, and sometimes noticeably so. Although often these were games where, okay, yeah, you could play at the native resolution, but if you were wanting a higher frame rate, oftentimes kicking on DLSS or FSR at the quality setting would boost frame rates considerably, and then would also then close that gap, oftentimes performance-wise, and then image quality-wise, NVIDIA would often have that advantage. So I guess I've got to say, if these GPUs cost the same, it really feels like I'd rather have the 4070 Ti if it wasn't for that annoying 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, did 12 gigabytes of VRAM matter? Well, here you see the memory allocation, and here you see the per process memory usage, GPU memory. You can see it on the NVIDIA hardware and the AMD hardware, and even on the AMD hardware where there's 20 gigabytes of VRAM available, if I just kind of scroll through this film here and we take a look, again, at the different resolutions, it kind of jumps around here a little bit. But here we're seeing it going up near 11, but still not even quite there to 11 gigabytes on the AMD hardware. Immortals of Aveum, we're pushing a little bit over 10. But I didn't see anything in this testing at all that went up to 12, let alone going past 12, although it was pushing near 12, and there are other games that aren't Unreal Engine 5 that are more VRAM heavy, so do keep that in mind. I'm not saying I like 12 gigabytes on the 4070 Ti, I'm just saying in our Unreal Engine 5 testing here, didn't seem to be an issue. But in general, my overall conclusion on most of this is really just, honestly, guys, let's go ahead and see if these 40 series super cards do anything. If they come in at about the same price, I think this is obviously going to be a better buy than what we have on these. But if they bump up the price $100 or more, then I don't know if it'd be worth it. But anyway, so I'm just interested to see something else happen at this price class because I'm kind of underwhelmed by both of these options. So anyway, but it was still interesting to take a look at how they did in Unreal Engine 5. And once again, if you want to take a look at GPUs that I think are going to be a better deal, the used market is a great option to sell your GPU to fund your upgrade at Jawa and get $10 off that first purchase following the link in the video description. And a huge thank you to channel members, channel subscribers, everybody. Hope all of you have an excellent day.